it is the reifier who, in virtue of denying the emptiness of these phenomena, denies their existence. And it is hence the reifier of emptiness who is impaled on both horns of the dilemma he presented to Nagarjuna, contradicting the ultimate truth. The opponent denies that these phenomena are empty, contradicting the conventional, he is forced to deny that they even exist. And so Nagarjuna can conclude. 20. If all this were non-empty, as in your view, there would be no arising and ceasing. Then the Four Noble Truths would become non-existent. The argument for this surprising turnabout reductio is straightforwardly presented in the subsequent verses. 21. If it is not dependently arisen, how could suffering come to be?
Suffering has been taught to be impermanent, and so cannot come from its own essence. The first noble truth is the truth of the existence of suffering. The opponent charges Nagarjuna with denying the existence of suffering through asserting its emptiness. But, Nagarjuna points out, since emptiness is dependent origination, when the opponent denies its emptiness, he denies that suffering is dependently originated. But he agrees that all phenomena are dependently originated. He thus is forced to deny the existence of suffering. But for Nagarjuna, since existence amounts to emptiness, the assertion of the emptiness of suffering affirms, rather than denies, its existence. 22. If something comes from its own essence, how could it ever be arisen? It follows that if one denies emptiness, there can be no arising of suffering. The second noble truth is that suffering has a cause. But, again, if the opponent asserts the non-emptiness of suffering, he asserts that it does not arise from causes and conditions. Yet Nagarjuna's analysis shows that it must, in virtue of its emptiness, be so arisen and thus accords with the second truth.
23. If suffering had an essence, its cessation would not exist. So if an essence is posited, one denies cessation. Similarly, the third noble truth is the truth of cessation. But inherently existent things cannot cease. Empty ones can. Nagarjuna's analysis thus explains the third truth, the reifier contradicts it. 24. If the path had an essence, cultivation would not be appropriate. If this path is indeed cultivated, it cannot have an essence. 25. If suffering, arising, and ceasing are non-existent, by what path could one seek to obtain the cessation of suffering? The fourth truth is the truth of the path. Again, the path only makes sense, and cultivation of the path is only possible, if suffering is impermanent and alleviable and if the nature of mind is empty and hence malleable. The path, after all, is a path from suffering and to awakening. If the former cannot cease and the latter does not depend on cultivation, the path is non-existent. But it is the analysis in terms of emptiness that makes this coherent. An analysis on which either the phenomena were inherently existent or on which emptiness was and the phenomena were therefore non-existent would make nonsense of the Four Noble Truths. Nagarjuna now turns to the implications for this line of argument for the three jewels, the Sangha, the Buddha, and the Dharma.
26. If non-understanding comes to be through its essence, how will understanding arise? Isn't essence stable? If ignorance is real and thus for the opponent inherently existent, there is no possibility of replacing it with insight. Therefore, the cultivation of Buddhist practice is impossible, or at least pointless. 27. In the same way, the activities of relinquishing, realizing, and meditating and the four fruits would not be possible. 28. For an essentialist, since the fruits through their essence are already unrealized, in what way could one attain them? So the essentialist has a dilemma if he wants to maintain the possibility of a community of practitioners, the Sangha, and of a path for them to practice, either the ignorance in which they find themselves and that serves as the impetus to practice is inherently existent, in which case practice is bound to be inefficacious, or the understanding they hope to achieve is inherently existent, in which case there is no need to practice since it is already present and no use in practicing since its existence is independent of practice.
29. Without the fruits, there are no attainers of the fruits or enterers. From this it follows that the 8 kinds of persons do not exist. If these don't exist, there is no spiritual community. The consequence of this is that there is no Sangha. The existence of the Sangha is entirely dependent upon the existence of the path and of the possibility of the fruits of the path increasing degrees of realization, since the Sangha is, by definition, the community of practitioners of the path. 30. From the non-existence of the noble truths would follow the non-existence of the true doctrine. If there is no doctrine and no spiritual community, how could a Buddha arise? But it would also follow that there is no Dharma, no true Buddhist doctrine, since that is grounded on the existence of the Four Noble Truths. And finally, as Nagarjuna emphasizes in Ziv, since the attainment of Buddhahood depends upon the study and practice of the Dharma within the context of the spiritual community, the opponent's view, unlike Nagarjuna's, has the consequence that no Buddha can arise. Moreover, if the Buddha and enlightenment were each inherently existent, they would be independent and could hence arise independently, which is absurd. To be a Buddha is to be enlightened, and vice versa.
31. For you, it would follow that a Buddha arises independent of enlightenment. And for you, enlightenment would arise independent of a Buddha. 32. For you, one who through his essence was unenlightened, even by practicing the path to enlightenment, could not achieve enlightenment. Nagarjuna has hence demonstrated that any reification, whether of the conventional or of the ultimate, ends up, paradoxically, denying the existence of the very things it reifies. And any reification renders the most fundamental Buddhist philosophical insights and practices incoherent. A thoroughgoing analysis in terms of emptiness, on the other hand, one that includes the understanding of the emptiness of emptiness, renders the entire phenomenal world as well as emptiness itself comprehensible as nominally existent, empirically actual, and dependently arisen real but essenceless. At this stage, Nagarjuna shifts to the charge leveled by the opponent in 24:2 that no practice is intelligible in the context of emptiness, and argues that, on the contrary, practice is intelligible only in that context. The argument is a reprise of earlier moves, and so is rather straightforward.
33. Moreover, one could never perform right or wrong actions. If this were all non-empty, what could one do? That with an essence cannot be produced. Nagarjuna now turns to the moral dimensions of the extreme positions and their consequences for the Buddhist doctrine of karma, specifically with regard to the consequences for one's own life of one's actions. Non-empty phenomena, such as the opponent wishes to posit, are seen, on analysis, to be static. But practice and action require dependence, change, and a regular relation between one's actions and one's future state. So in the preceding verse, Nagarjuna notes that in a static, non-empty world, we can't even make sense of the possibility of action. He then points out, 24, that even were action possible, in virtue of the impossibility of change and dependence in